Hi, I'm Justin Barrett, president of Blueprint 1543.
And I am Skylar Barrett. Welcome to This Integrated Life, a podcast for those who seek to engage with life's biggest questions using the tools of the sciences with theology. Welcome, Dr. Barrett. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? It's good to see you here again.
I'm doing all right. Today, I thought we would talk about the role of apologetics and whether it's doing what people hope it would do, whether it's actually improving relations or improving Christianity's standing with the secular world, the science world, or if it's detracting from that aim. It's a complicated and nuanced topic. I understand if we can't come down hard on one side or not, but I thought it was worth talking over anyway.
Okay, sure. I guess the angle that I'll want to go is particularly apologetics that involves the sciences in particular. Because one of the things that I have found in our work at Blueprint 1543, where we're trying to encourage a sophisticated, responsible engagement between the Christian faith and the sciences, is that a lot of people assume, oh, so you're doing apologetics.
Right.
And real quick, for those who don't know what apologetics mean, it sounds a little bit like the word apologize, and it doesn't really mean apologize, but it's not unrelated. The basic idea of apologetics is to offer some kind of a rational and persuasive defense or account of the Christian faith, particularly to people who are not believers in the Christian faith. That's kind of the role of apologetics. So to give that kind of rational, coherent, and persuasive account of the Christian faith. And so apologetics often does sort of drift into a lot of different spaces, depending on who it is that the apologist for the Christian faith is speaking to, who their interlocutors are, who it is that they want to give this defense to. So if they're on the more philosophical side of things, often it looks like philosophy of religion, and some philosophy of religion and other kinds of philosophy will drift in. If their background is more in, say, legal studies, they might give arguments that sound a little bit more like evidence in a court case. Well, here's the evidence for the Christian faith. Now you decide, oh, member of the jury. If it's somebody who's historically inclined, then they might want to sort of lead it with lots of historical types of consideration and historical evidence. So there are lots of different ways to approach apologetics. And so it's not surprising then that if especially Christians are wanting to talk to sciencey people, they might bring the sciences into the picture. And so sometimes people who work in this space at the intersection of the sciences and Christianity often do engage in apologetics, or at least apologetics-adjacent types of discussions. It kind of makes sense for us to talk about it here a little bit.
Yeah, and right, we've seen that people, even outside of Christianity, have actually used your work in their apologetic endeavors as a possible pushing off point. So I thought we might reflect a little bit on that too, and how you feel about that.
Sure, we can do that. What Skylar is referring to there is that we've discovered in both in digital media platforms, but also in written works, there have been now at least a handful of Muslim thinkers and communicators who are finding in some of my work from the cognitive science of religion resources, intellectual resources that support, or at least appear to support, certain kinds of doctrinal claims within Islam. In particular, now I'm not, if I try to say the name of the term, I will say it wrong. So I'll just explain what it is. It's the idea that I'm told is a common idea in Islamic thought, that we come into the world with a natural predisposition to form beliefs in God, in Allah. And it is through the corrupting influences of the world around us that somebody would maybe become an atheist or agnostic. So it's kind of turning on its head the idea that, no, you've got to get, you're born an atheist and you get indoctrinated into believing in God. They're saying, no, it's the other way around, that actually the conceptual path of least resistance is belief in God. And that gets corrupted or distorted or misdirected because of socialization, because of enculturation, and so forth. I'm told that is a widespread Muslim kind of thought, a piece of Muslim thought or theology. And there is a Christian parallel to that. That is probably most frequently known as the sensus divinitatis. Sorry for busting out Latin, but the idea of sensus divinitatis is, well, it just means sense of the divine. And the idea that it's trying to capture, and there are other similar labels for this, the God-shaped vacuum in our hearts, or what it is pointing to a little bit fuzzy, someone say inchoate or vague sense of the divine that seems to be part of our nature, that God has somehow implanted into all of us in our nature, a sense that God's out there. Now, it's not perfect. It needs to be fine-tuned. It needs to be put into focus. And it, too, can be frustrated by either our will being tuned to sinful acts or the culture around us and so forth. But at least some thinkers like John Calvin claimed that by nature we have this inside of us. And there's a lot of debate around exactly what that means, how fine-tuned it is, under what conditions does it get triggered, under what conditions does it get frustrated, how much does it get frustrated or distorted. But that's the general idea, sensus divinitatis. And so it's thought that work from the cognitive science religion, including some of my work in my book, Born Believers, especially, maybe supports both that Muslim version and the Christian version of this doctrine. Because at least my take is still, I say still because the book was written in 2012, but still my view that the scientific evidence concerning child development and also some experimental studies in adults across cultures and other kinds of ethnographic evidence points to the idea that having some kind of natural receptivity to at least one God does seem to be the conceptual path of least resistance for us. It seems to readily arise in normal human environmental conditions. And it actually takes a little bit of work to frustrate that tendency. And that's the reason why, while there certainly are atheists in the world, atheist countries, atheist cultures are very rare. And most of those that even are, we characterize as sort of atheist cultures, often still have little gods in them of one sort or another. And China is a clear case in point. Iceland is another. There are plenty. So, and the reason is because people have a natural tendency in this direction. Now, we started by talking about apologetics, though. And so how is that an apologetic move? Well, what it's suggesting is a claim that used to be made basically on theological grounds now has some evidence coming from the sciences that was not generated to try to support those claims, by the way. It was generated independently of those claims. Seems to be converging with those theological claims. And so it gives you more reason to think that the theological claims could be correct. Mm-hmm. And so you could take that and say, aha, now we have good reasons for believing those theological positions, at least better reasons. You might not believe them, but you might move okay, I'm a little more likely to believe it than I was before.
Right.
Is that what you were getting at? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that was it. But considering it's your research, do you feel like it's appropriate for it to be used that way? Right. It's a descriptive piece of information that's used to try to move a needle in a prescriptive, persuasive way.
It is. In this particular case, I think it is used largely to say that the descriptive claim from these theologies is correct.
Right.
And I feel more comfortable with that than maybe other kinds of uses. But sure, I don't have any objections to people responsibly taking on board scientific findings that seem appropriate, if they are representing those findings accurately, if they're holding them with the appropriate degree of confidence, because this is still a new science area, so the story could change, and we need to be open to that. What are the risks for Christians in being too enthusiastic about grabbing a hold of a particular scientific area and saying, see, proves God? Is if that science changes, then it's kind of embarrassing. Because then you're like, okay, never mind. I have to remove that proof for God. And if I have to do that too many times, it starts looking like my evidential basis for God starts diminishing.
Right.
Because maybe I tried to build my house in the wrong place, on the wrong foundation. So that would be the risk of being too enthusiastic about some of these sorts of pieces of scientific evidence and trying to use them apologetically. As famous apologists like Alistair McGrath, who does make use of the sciences in his work, he raises a similar kind of caution, and even advises that, look, apologetics really should be reserved for experts, people who really know theology and really know what they're talking about, because there are these risks, these hazards of that sort lurking around. I think there's another hazard.
Okay.
The other hazard, probably many hazards. One, though, for sure is, at least from an apologetics perspective, is, it might not be just that, say, Christianity can use that piece of evidence in support of its claims. It might be that other traditions that you think are maybe wrong-headed or off the mark can also use the same evidence. We've given an example.
Right.
Many of Christians, of course, don't want people to become Muslims. But it turns out the evidence in support of the Muslim doctrine and the Christian doctrine, at least in this case, might actually overlap considerably. So it's not really evidence for Christianity per se, as much as for some kind of theism that might be a Muslim theism or a Christian theism or a Jewish theism, for that matter, or some other theism that has similar kinds of claims. So you want to keep an eye on that. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that's a thing that you got to be aware of. The more concerning one for me is that, and this is speaking a little bit more just on a psychological level, is that I think apologetics is a dangerous game.
Okay.
It's dangerous because it has a tendency, especially for those of us who don't have a lot of spiritual maturity, to make us feel get kind of puffed up, to use the biblical language, get kind of full of ourselves, and to start acting like, a little bit like we're a pugilist, a boxer, a fighter going into a fight, trying to score points instead of trying to love people into the kingdom of God. It's like, I'm going to score. And partly I'm reflecting my own experience in my life. I used to love, back when I was in sixth grade. Yeah, I know, we're going way back. When I was in sixth grade, my two best buddies in school, as I recall, one was a Jehovah's Witness and one was a Mormon.
This sounds like the beginning of a joke.
I know. An evangelical Christian, a Mormon, and a Jehovah's Witness walk into a playground. And I was a smarty pants kid, and I loved to try to score points against these guys. And it was wrong. It was so wrong. Because why should I expect these kids to defend the theology of their faith? Just because I thought I knew stuff. But I loved the idea of, I'm going to get him on this one. I mean, it's just not being a good friend. I was kind of a jerk. All right. So, and sadly, I didn't know it. I didn't know I was until my mom kind of started calling me out for it. She's like, really? You're going to be like that? I was like, sorry, Mom. But some of us don't learn that. very early. And here we are
Right.
at a 20-somethings, and we're still out there trying to score points instead of actually showing care for people. So it can be bad for our soul. I think that's another reason why older, wiser apologists like Alistair McGrath would say, novices, don't go rushing into this space. It can be bad for you. It can also be bad for, in this case, it would be bad for, I would totally understand if those old chums of mine back now reflect back and go, remember that Christian kid we used to hang out with? Oh, yeah, he was kind of a jerk. And now I've actually ruined our witness in the world because I was kind of a jerk.
Right.
So there's that side of it. If you're going to do apologetics, it needs to be done from the right spirit. It needs to be done with a generous heart. It needs to be done with patience, kindness, and humility. And it needs to seek to learn from others as well as inform. Oh, I'm going to show these poor ignorant buffoons what they don't know. That's not a biblical approach to evangelism and let alone apologetics. So there's that.
That little thing.
That little thing.
The little thing.
Little thing. I do find that actually lots of learning apologetics, when you read up on apologetics, which is kind of fun to read sometimes, let's be honest. It's fun to read.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And quick aside, Anna reads a lot more apologetics than I do at this point. And so she's going to be very sore with you for taking one of her topics, I'm sure.
You snooze, you lose.
Oh, you think she's snoozing, really? Oh, boy. She's doing.
I hope she is.
Yeah, because otherwise she's coming after you.
The nice thing about people living thousands of miles away, you get some buffer.
But apologetics is fun to read. It can be really educational. It can be informative, even for believers. And I actually think that so there's the reading apologetics, there's consuming apologetics, and there's doing apologetics. I think
Right.
McGrath is right. Doing apologetics, that's kind of advanced level kind of skill set. Right. Consuming apologetics, reading this stuff, that can be edifying if you're going into it with your heart in the right place, not as the Bible or Christian theology or Christian thought is some puzzle that needs to be solved, but right. I'm trying to learn more about God and God's world and what God wants from me and God, how he relates to humanity, what our obligations are to God, and how different areas of thought, philosophy, history, or the sciences can help illuminate who God is, his relationship to the world, what our relationship to each other should be. If we go into it with that heart, that I want to grow from this study, well, then I can help see from other people's work in apologetics how different pieces of knowledge go together to help form a more coherent worldview, Christian worldview. Right. And then it can be really edifying. It can be good, and it can be a little bit fun. Why fun? Because often in apologetics, the debates are clearer than we often get in the rest of life. It's like somebody argues for this, and well, here's the evidence for this, and here's the evidence for the counter argument, and right. It's like, okay, it can be engaging a little bit, and it's like, oh, I'm learning from that engagement because I didn't think of those things, or I did think of that, but not that, and I never saw those connections before. So it can be very edifying branch of theology to read up on for just those reasons. But then notice that that's not me doing apologetics. That's me benefiting from reading other people's exercises in apologetics. And that's pretty cool.
Right. I've always thought it's for your average Christian practitioner. Apologetics is good for addressing your own personal doubts, not going out and attacking the arguments of other people. Because, as you said, odds are you don't have the goods to back that up. And you could make things worse.
That's a really great point. Yeah, that's right. And for those who don't, or might have just thought that what Skylar said sounds really strange. What do you mean doubts? Christians have doubts. Let me let you in on a little secret. And it's okay. God's big enough to handle our doubts. We all have things, aspects of claims of Christian doctrine or episodes in Christian living that are just puzzling, that are confusing, that we go, I have no idea what's going on here. Or, really, God, are you going to come through in this situation? Or, God, I don't see how this claim and this claim go together. I'm not seeing it. Those kinds of moments of doubt or confusion or perplexity, they arise, and it's okay. And you're right, Skylar. I think that one of the nice things apologetics does is try to work out some of those, at least give examples of somebody else's working out of that. It might not be a workout of the problem for everybody and for all times and all places, but at least it creates here's a roadmap. Think of it this way of an overgrown forest that I just don't see how I get from point A to point B through this forest, but somebody else has picked through the forest, kind of tried to blaze a trail with their little machete. It might be a narrow and scratchy pathway forward anyway, but at least it's something that'll get you started in the right direction. You can follow in somebody else's footsteps who's gone before you and try to get it sorted and try to make progress in the direction that you want to go. I think apologetics can be very good for that as well. So I think you're right about that.
Right. And with the doubt things, just quickly returning to that, right. I think doubt gets bad rap because of Thomas, right? Doubting Thomas. He's seen as bad guy. Jesus still accepted him and he ended up believing, right? So
there's not a bad guy.
No, not a bad guy. Just a guy who thought it would be weird that the guy he saw murdered is back alive again, which at the time, pretty reasonable. It's not crazy.
Yep. No, Jesus doesn't give Thomas a bad time. He actually meets him where he is and says, all right, you want evidence? I got it. I got the goods.
Yep.
Show me the receipts. Here they are. Yep.
And I thought I'd ask you as a follow-up. You have had a number of, I don't know if they would fall into the realm of apologetics, but getting close to that for at least Christians participating in the sciences, between your conversations with A.C. Grayling on radio in the UK and your debate with, it was in New Zealand, the head of the Skeptics Society. Oh, what's his face?
Michael Shermer.
Yeah. And what did you think of those as experiences, as somebody being put in the hot seat almost?
Well, I'm not a real big fan of the debate format. And yeah, it was actually a bit of the radio thing was actually, that was a conversation with a radio personality, AC Grayling. He and I sort of went back and forth with a couple of articles. They were little newspaper articles at the time, as I recall. But I don't like it very much.
Okay.
This is sort of my experience. I don't like it very much because the format doesn't create appropriate space to engage each other as beings.
Okay.
And I think that's important. We often argue past each other because we're not, especially that performative, when other people are watching the debate, because it means you're playing to different audiences instead of actually engaging each other as best you can.
Okay, so you're representing a position instead of a person.
Yeah,
is that the problem? Okay,
that's part of it. And so there's not seeking to understand, well, where is he coming from, and how can I meet him where he is? It's hard to do in that format. It's kind of discouraged by the format. So it's not my thing. I think other people are really good at it. It's not really my thing. It was kind of fun to do a little bit. But I enjoyed much more when after the debate with Michael Shermer that we went out for dinner with a couple of other people and had a conversation. That was more fun. Now, we didn't go as deep into the stuff, but we were engaging each other just as human beings, and found some interesting common ground there through that kind of discussion. I like that a lot better. That said, I'm not dissing people who like to get in there and sort of mix it up a little bit. And there is a time and place for that kind of format because it does put on display and sharpen where disagreements are around certain kinds of topics. And that's useful. That's useful. A more positive kind of version that's not quite a debate format, but it's a discussion format that I've really enjoyed is some of the occasions that Veritas Forum has hosted that I've been a part of on university campuses. I think I've done 5 or 6 of those. UC Davis, at University of Tennessee, Yale, Brown. I feel like there's at least one more in there somewhere. They were so much fun. Caltech, I did something a little bit similar to this.
Right.
Their format. So typically they've got a Christian scholar, professor, a scientist, a thinker of some sort, going into someone else's university and having a conversation with a professor from that university who is not a Christian. That's not always how they do it, but that's a common format. And then they have a discussion around a particular topic. And some of those have been a lot of fun because what they put on display is, yes, differences of opinion depending on people's worldview, but also where it turns out there's a lot more common ground than a lot of people realize. Where, for instance, at Yale, I talked to developmental psychologist Paul Bloom.
Right.
And we have so much common ground about a lot of the scientific work we do and what we think it means. We just draw different implications out of it for what does this mean for a worldview? What does it mean for your life, the universe, and everything else? But the science, there's all this common ground. And I think it's really important for people to see that we're not quite as divided as you might think. So those Veritas Forum, I mean, the nice thing is those videos, most of those are online too. So you can look them up, you can find them. And those are some of my favorite speaking events because I think there is that real chance to get to engage somebody who is thoughtful, creative, accomplished scholar who just approaches things from a different worldview than I do. Well, that's fun. And we're not out there trying to embarrass each other. We're not trying to, be mean to each other. But we're going to represent our differences as well as our similarities as strongly as we can. That's good stuff.
Yeah, that is. So if you had to give some advice to a Christian in the sciences who's being confronted with stuff from colleagues or just people in their life that would traditionally fall into topics that an apologist would tackle, what would your advice to them be? What do you think is the best course of action? So you have somebody who doesn't necessarily have a strong theological background. They don't have a ton of training. Let's just say they're a church attending, practicing Christian, just a member of the congregation. What do you think would be your advice to them if they're confronted in this situation?
I guess I would advise a couple of things. One would be try to assess based on your relationship with the person, what you know of them, how they are confronting you with a particular thing. Are they of what's going on there? Right. Are they really seeking to learn something? Are they really seeking some understanding from you and are viewing you as a resource? Or are they just trying to play gotcha?
Right.
Because if really all they're trying to do is play gotcha and they don't really want to know what your answer is, well, there's not a lot you can do in that moment. They're not interested in learning. They're not interested in your perspective, really. They are interested in scoring points. They're interested in trying to get you to doubt yourself or to rattle you for whatever reason. That's not the grounds for a good conversation.
Right.
And if that's what you think is going on, then I think you find some way to politely excuse yourself from the conversation.
Okay.
It's a conversation not worth having. If, on the other hand, you think, no, this is a person who maybe they've come on hard, maybe they're being a little aggressive, but I think they really do want to know. And it's okay to ask people, is this really something that you want to know? Or maybe there's a question behind the question that they really want to know. And that's okay too. That's another part of that initial, okay, what's going on here? So sometimes when I've been confronted with those types of stuff, the first thing I do is answer follow-up questions or ask follow-up questions.
Right.
Like, first I want to know, did I understand you correctly? So is this what you're asking me? Okay, why does that interest you? All right, tell me more about that. Now, at this point, some people will go, oh, you're stalling, or whatever it is. Maybe I am. But I'm also trying to understand, what are you asking me? And what do you really want to know? Do you really want to know it? So often, the first thing I do is ask genuine questions to try to figure out what's going on. And what's the question behind the question? And that's important before you start offering anything.
Okay.
Right? Is to just understand. And I do think that's a Jesus thing, right? That's his tactic oftentimes too. People will come and ask him questions, and what he's going to do is give them an answer to something they didn't ask. And you're like, why did he do that? Because he knows the real question behind the question. We don't, so we have to ask. We have to figure it out.
We have to do intermediary steps.
That's right. We gotta like, what's going on here? I did at I mentioned these Veritas forums. I do recall a time. So the great thing when I did the UC Davis one, which was so much fun. It was so much fun. That one, as I recall, it was a solo act. They didn't have me talking to anybody, but what they did do is set up a very lengthy discussion session afterwards. So after doing the main lecture hall lecture to 600-700 people, then I went to a smaller classroom where people who wanted to keep talking afterwards could show up. And as I recall, a whole group from one of these student atheist or humanist groups or something, they came in, and I could tell by their body language they are ready for war. And they came in and all right, and and the first one launches into a question, and it was a smart question. It was a good question. But it was the kind of question that was clearly planned, well thought through, and not obvious. So I started to explain to everybody else in the room what the question was. I'm like, great question. Let me, and then I unpacked the question for everybody else so that they could benefit from the discussion as well. While I'm unpacking it, the student goes, that's not an answer to the question. And I'm like, you're right. It's not. No, you really did ask a great question. I want to just make sure everybody understands it so that when I answer it, they'll understand what we're talking about here. So clearly, that was a student who really just wanted to score points. It wasn't about, I think it's important for everybody to be thinking about this, and I'm going to bravely go out there. And at least sure didn't look like it to me. I tried to give him a good answer anyway. So my advice, try to discern what's really going on there. Does the person really want an answer to this question? Is there another question they want an answer to? What's some of the context for the question? Because, for instance, if they're asking something like, so how do you resolve the probabilistic problem of evil? You're like, all right, that's a philosophy student probably who's going to say that stuff. But why is that question important to them? It might turn out that question is important to them because their mother just died of cancer. So the real question isn't, how do you, resolve the probabilistic problem of evil? It's do you have anything to say to me that's going to help me understand how a perfectly good God could let my mom die? That's the real question.
Yeah.
Well, they might need more sympathy and compassion than they need rational answers at that point.
Right.
So that's why first step, try to answer, ask follow-up questions and get really clear on what's going on. That's, the first bit of advice. And through that process, then second bit is Well, then you're going to be able to figure out if you're in over your head or if you're up to the challenge of this moment.
Right.
Because it could be that you know perfectly well you don't have the answer to the question they're looking for.
And that's okay.
Absolutely. And if that's what you figured out, be honest about that. I think it's perfectly okay. It's like, that is a great question. I don't have an answer for you. And then, if you feel so inclined, you might offer to try to find out what a good answer to that is. But it's perfectly okay to say, great question. I don't know. If you can use that to pivot to what you do know, and it doesn't seem like you're being sort of slippery, if you know what I mean. Like, that's a really good question. I don't know. But what I do know is Jesus loves you just the way you are, but so much that he's not going to leave you that way. And, okay, easy. Maybe that's the right thing. Maybe that is absolutely true. And that's what that person needs to hear. But maybe that's not the way for them to hear it as a misdirection move. I don't know. Look over here. It might be. Great question. I don't know. That's not a question that's bothered me in my faith, but I understand that that's important to you. So let's try to figure it out. Where would we look for an answer? Right? Where would we look for an answer? And what that models for the other person then is care, first of all, understanding, and that it's okay to have questions. It doesn't rattle you if there are questions you can't answer. But that there are also, you're interested in finding out too. You are a fellow traveler doing your best to figure this stuff out. And you really are curious. You really do want to know. I mean, if that's genuine, maybe you don't want to know. That's okay too. It's like,
I don't care.
Not really an issue for me. I did see that in a philosophy of religion class once where the professor at all term had done a wonderful job answering so many different types of questions. But one of the questions, and it was actually related to what's known as the problem of evil, or, the problem of human suffering. And how can a perfectly good, all-knowing, all-powerful God allow bad stuff happen? But one of the student questions that was brought up was, how do, most people were talking about things like, animal suffering, innocent animals or babies or painful deaths of, human beings and that sort of stuff. And then somebody brought up the whole, how do we square a perfectly good, all-powerful, all-knowing God with the idea that I can't learn things as much as I'd like. I can't know everything that I'd like to know. And the professor went, yeah, I'm just not even going to deal with that one. No thanks.
Your question stinks.
Your question stinks. And it kind of felt like this is a big lecture hall and everybody heard this happen and it was like, yeah, that question really did stink. Yeah.
Nobody wants the answer to that.
Nobody really cares. So don't fake it. Don't fake like, oh, what a great question. Like, no, not a good question. Hopefully that's not what you're going to get when you're confronted. You're going to get sincere questions that actually really matter to at least enough people to make them worth looking into. So figure out what the real question is and if the person really wants answers. If you can answer it, great. Do so with compassion, with your thoughts, your tone, your approach tuned to what the real question is. And if you can't, model the, hey, I don't know the answer. Maybe it's the case you don't know the answer because it's never bothered you. Maybe it has bothered you and you don't have an answer. It's okay to connect with a person on that level too and say, great question. I've wondered that one too. And I don't have a satisfactory answer yet.
Right.
I do still think the preponderance of evidence leads me to my faith in Christ. But that's a question I don't have sorted. I just don't. And I'll give you a real example of one where I feel that way. I don't know that it would be a big deal to many people, but I know philosophers do talk about things like, and other cognitive scientists do, like, why is it that the resurrection of the body is so important in Christianity? Doesn't that speak against the idea of an eternal soul that is separable from human bodies? Or another way to put it, what's the relationship between our mind or our soul and our body?
Right.
And how does that fit this idea of like Christian heaven or, resurrection of the dead and stuff? How does that even make sense? The Bible has this language about the dead will rise first and they'll come out of the graves and at the end times and stuff. But those bodies have decayed. What does it mean they've come out of the graves? What's going on there? My answer, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And have I solved the mind-body problem? No. Is it an interesting problem? Well, sure it is. It is kind of an interesting problem. I trust that there is a solution to the problem. I don't have it.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about why that problem bothers you, yeah, let's talk about it. That could be fun. That could be enlightening. It could be engaging. It could lead to other kinds of things. That having an answer to that hasn't felt to me like something I've got to get sorted. But tell me, why do you think that one is standing in the way of you believing in God and putting your faith in Christ? Let's talk about that. I'd like to hear it.
I want to hear it too, because I don't know how that particular one is the hook you're going to hang your hat on.
Yeah.
So I mean, that one's really abstract.
It might not be. And that's okay. But somebody could, because it might 100%. Connect to something else, or maybe it's because they used to have a belief in, say, ghosts or afterlife kinds of beliefs. Or maybe that answering that question is wrapped up with really something like, will I ever see my deceased mother again?
Right.
And it sure looks like when I talk to sciencey people, they think there is nothing other than our physical bodies. Minds are just an epiphenomena of our physical bodies or a byproduct of our neural architecture or whatever their account is. That seems to mean that once you're dead, you're dead. That's the end of the story. And even if God has the power, if God exists, surely God has the power to resurrect. But is it that same person, or is it just a copy person? And if it's a copy person, well, I'm not interested in meeting a copy of my mom in the next life. I want to meet my real mom again in the next life. So maybe there's something really interesting behind the question that they can't quite articulate initially, but through conversation, you'll start seeing. And that's when you start engaging the real person and can have a real conversation that might be beneficial to both of you. So I know I'm painting with big sloppy brushstrokes here, but those are some of my reactions to what do you do if you get confronted by these things? By all means, don't get defensive if you can help it, even if the person's being a jerk. Because being a jerk back usually doesn't move things forward in any constructive way. And if you really do have a confident faith, you don't need to be defensive and jerky about it. You can be firm, you can be clear, you can say, I'm not going to put up with nonsense.
Right.
You don't have to put up with crazy aspersions and things like that. So one that you and I know we both get sometimes is the whole, this whole faith and science thing. Why are you bothering that? Everybody knows that Christians hate the sciences, and they have for, 1,000 years. 1,000 years. And
because science has been around for 1,000 years.
He says sarcastically, for those who don't know, it hasn't.
It hasn't.
Whatever it is, it hasn't. But it's okay to then shut that down and say, yeah, it's just not factually true. Okay, you're starting with some bad facts.
Right.
And that old chestnut, you're entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. And if you're not willing to engage in the facts at all, and there's going to be some wiggle room around the edges, sure, we get that. Some disagreements, but some basic facts. If we can't even agree on those, it's really hard to see how we can have a fruitful conversation going forward. That's not somebody who really wants to learn and grow if they're just going to go, no, I can't hear you. No. Yeah.
Right. And I think that is something important for people to know, is that if you don't have enough in common with the person who's you are talking with, as far as like values and baseline thoughts and feelings about the world, it's really hard to have a productive conversation with them on these topics. And you don't have to be the person to answer their questions, right?
Yeah.
You are not called to answer the question of every person who has questions about Christianity. That's not your problem. You might be called to listen to them initially, but beyond that, I don't know.
You remind me of somebody that you and I both had conversations with once upon a time, who had given up on the idea of anything being true.
Yes, I remember this person.
Had given up on basic principles of logic, like the law of non-contradiction. That something can't be true and false at the same time. He'd say, oh, yeah, they can. And they're like, so I think you're right. It's very hard to go anywhere with somebody who's in that space. And that's when, you kind of take off the logician hat, because you're like, they're not going to play logic. They're not going to play reason with us. Something weird is going on psychologically here. So maybe the best thing you can do is, I don't know, play yard games with them and, roast weenies over a fire and just be there.
Right.
But they're not interested in truth if they've given up on truth.
Yeah. They need an experience at that point, and you're probably not the person to do it. Maybe you are.
Maybe you are.
But don't worry about the argument.
But definitely that ends up not falling into apologetics at that point.
No.
If that's what they need as an experience. But well, good conversation, Skylar. Thanks for raising the topic. Again, I warn you, Anna's probably going to be a little bit sore, but no doubt she's going to have her own fresh take that she's going to want to bring into this when she's back with us.
Sounds like I've just given her an opportunity for a follow-up episode, and I'm sure she will follow up.
Nice positive reframe.
I do what I can.
Well, thank you all for joining us for this conversation. It's certainly not the final word on apologetics, especially as it interacts with the sciences. So, as always, if you've got questions, comments, suggestions that you'd like to hear us talk about, please do leave them in the comment section. Share this with people, in your sphere of influence who you think this might be valuable for. Thanks for joining us on this podcast, on This Integrated Life. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, Skylar.
Thank you. All right.
Until next time.